The remote was still warm in my hand when the screen went black. 1 second, Steve Harvey was laughing at some fool's wrong answer. And the next second, my living room was just me, my chair, and silence so sudden it rang in my ears. I turned my head slow, because at 71 years old, I don't move fast for anybody. And there stood Marvella, holding my own remote like it belonged to her. "You're useless," she said, soft and flat, like she was reading off a grocery list. "Go on to your room, old woman. I own this house now." My name is Doretha Bramwell. I have buried a husband, raised one son, and sat in that same armchair every Sunday at 7 o'clock for longer than Marvella has been alive. I did not raise my voice. I did not even rise from the chair right away. I just looked at her, then past her, to my son standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel over his shoulder. Garnett was smiling, not a nervous smile, not an embarrassed one. A real smile, like his wife had told a joke at a cookout and he was waiting to see if I'd laugh too. "I want to ask you something before I go on, because I think about it every single time I tell this part. What time do you turn your television on for your shows? 7 sharp, like me? Or do you let it run all afternoon? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. Now back to that living room, because I have never in my life walked away from a fight. But I have also never in my life mistaken the right moment to leave one. I stood up. My knees don't move as easy as they used to, but I stood up straight, the way Arthur taught me to stand when I was young and scared of nothing in this world but disappointing him. I walked past Marvella without a word. I walked past my son without looking at his face, because if I looked at his face one more second, I was going to say something I couldn't take back. And Doretha Bramwell does not raise her voice in a house she still pays the taxes on. I went to the little dish by the front door, the one Arthur bought me from a flea market in Memphis 30 years ago, and I took my keys out of it. Marvella said something behind me, something about how I was being dramatic, how nobody told me to leave. I didn't answer her. I didn't slam the door either. I closed it soft, the way you close a door on a room you don't plan on coming back into the same way. The night air outside was cooler than I expected for June. I got into my car, the same one Arthur helped me pick out the year before he passed, and I sat there for a long minute with my hands on the wheel, not crying, just breathing. Then I picked up my phone. I scrolled past my church group, past my hairdresser, past Garnett's name sitting right there like nothing had happened, until my thumb landed on a name I hadn't dialed in 3 years. A name I never thought I'd need to call again. My finger hovered over it, and something in my chest told me once I pressed it, there wasn't going to be any going back to the woman I was an hour ago. My thumb pressed down before I let myself think twice about it. It rang twice. On the third ring, a deep voice answered, careful, like a man who doesn't pick up unknown trouble without bracing for it first. Doretha. Just my name, nothing else. Like he already knew this call wasn't coming for small talk. "Reuben," I said, "I'm sorry to call so late." "You don't apologize to me," he said. "Tell me what happened." So I did. I didn't dress it up, and I didn't make it smaller than it was either. I told him about the television going dark mid-show, about Marvella's voice, flat as a closed door, about the word useless sitting in my own living room like it had been invited to dinner. I told him about Garnett's face. I told him I was sitting in my car outside the house I raised my son in, and I didn't have anywhere I needed to be tonight, but I needed somebody to know. Reuben didn't say much while I talked. That's always been his way. Arthur used to say the man listens like he's taking notes nobody else can see. When I finished, he asked me one question. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing," I said, and I meant it down to the bone. "I'm not calling you to fix anything, Reuben. I'm calling because you're the only one left who knew Arthur well enough to understand why this hurts the way it does." The line went quiet. Not awkward quiet. Thinking quiet. "How long has it been this bad?" he finally asked. I looked out through the windshield at my dark house. Longer than I wanted to admit. He let that answer sit. You should have called sooner. Maybe. You would have said that was none of my business. Maybe that too. That got the smallest sound out of him. Not quite a laugh. Close enough. We sat with the silence a moment. The kind old friends don't rush to fill. Then he spoke again. Doretha, where are you right now? In my car. Don't stay there. I'm fine. No, he said. You're 71 years old, sitting in a driveway trying to convince yourself you're fine. That's not the same thing. I closed my eyes. Because the worst part about old friends is they already know where all your hiding places are. I can stay with Delphine, I admitted. Good. You don't have to worry about me. I'm going to anyway. I looked down at the steering wheel. The tears still hadn't come. I wasn't sure if that was strength or shock. Maybe both. Thank you for answering. Doretha. Yeah? If Arthur were here, what do you think he'd tell you tonight? I smiled, despite myself. Probably that I've tolerated nonsense longer than necessary. Sounds like him. That silence settled between us again. Comfortable this time. Then his voice changed. Just slightly. Not urgent, not alarmed. Decided. Get some sleep tonight. Reuben, get some sleep. I knew that tone. I'd heard it before, usually right before he made up his mind about something. I will. Good. The call ended a few minutes later. I sat there another moment looking at the dark windows of my house before starting the car. At the time, I thought I'd just called an old friend because I needed somebody to listen. Looking back now, I think that phone call set a lot more in motion than either of us said out loud that night. 3 years before that television went dark, I sat at my own kitchen table watching my son sign papers, and I thought I was watching the start of something good. Arthur had been gone 6 months by then. The lawyer laid everything out plain across that table. The rental properties, the charitable gifts, the plans Arthur had spent years putting in place long before illness ever forced him to think seriously about dying. I remember sitting there overwhelmed by how much thought he'd put into things I hadn't even known needed planning. Arthur was always like that. He believed preparation was a form of love, not because he expected the worst, because he wanted the people he cared about protected if the worst ever arrived. I remember asking him one afternoon before he passed why he'd spent so much time putting everything in order. He took my hand and smiled. Because people change under pressure. I laughed and told him he was being dramatic. He shook his head. No, I'm being realistic. Then he said something I didn't fully understand until much later. I trust Garnett's heart. That's never worried me. What worries you? The people he'll trust. At the time, I thought it was one of those things older men say when they're trying to sound wise. Years later, I realized it wasn't wisdom. It was concern. Garnett came to me about 2 months after everything was settled. He sat where his father used to sit, turning a coffee cup slowly between his hands. Mama, let me stay here with you, he said. I'll keep an eye on you. Make sure you're not rattling around in this big house by yourself. I told him yes, before he even finished asking. Not because of paperwork, not because of plans, because he was my son. And because that's what mothers do when their children ask for a place beside them. He moved in that same week. 6 months later, he brought home a young woman named Marvella Dabney. Within a year, they were married under string lights. Garnett hung himself across my backyard. I liked her well enough at first. She was quiet at family gatherings, watchful, the kind of quiet I mistook for shyness. I didn't think much about the fact that her father never attended the wedding. There was a card, a generous check, an apology. Marvella said they weren't especially close. I didn't push. A grown woman's relationship with her father isn't mine to dig through. The day she moved her things in fully, I stood in the hallway watching her walk through the house, slowly, carefully. Her eyes moved across the crown molding Arthur installed himself. The built-in shelves, the hardwood floors, the backyard beyond the kitchen window. Something about the way she looked at everything unsettled me. Not enough to name it, just enough to notice it. She wasn't admiring the memories attached to the place. She seemed to be measuring it somehow, adding things up, calculating. When I asked about her family, she answered politely but briefly. When I asked about the wedding plans her mother kept talking about, she changed the subject. When I asked who'd eventually walk her down the aisle if they held a second ceremony back home, she smiled and called it complicated. Then she moved on. I let it go. Looking back, that's the part I remember most. Not what she said, what she didn't say. Sometimes people tell you exactly who they are through the subjects they work hardest to avoid. I just wasn't listening closely enough yet. About a year into their marriage, Garnett sat across from me at dinner and cleared his throat twice before he said anything, which told me right away whatever was coming wasn't really his idea. "Mama, Marvella and I were talking," he started, eyes on his plate instead of me. "We think maybe we should start contributing something. Rent, or toward the bills, something like that. Just so it feels fair to everybody." I set my fork down, slow. "Fair how, Garnet? This is your home. I told you that the day you moved in." I know, he said quick. The way he does when he's already decided he agrees with me but doesn't want to say so out loud in front of her. Marvella was standing at the counter, back to us, washing a dish that was already clean, listening to every word without turning around once. "It's not about the money," I said, and I meant it. "If it was about money, I'd have told you myself a long time ago. What's this really about?" Garnett didn't answer right away. Marvella did, without turning from the sink. "It's about us having some say in our own home, Mrs. Bramwell. That's all. We're not children living off you." "Nobody said you were children," I said, keeping my voice even, the way I've kept it through harder conversations than this one. "But this house isn't run on a vote, baby. It's run on what your father-in-law left behind. And what he left behind has terms to it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to make a Tuesday dinner more comfortable." Marvella turned around then, drying her hands on a towel, and looked at me with something behind her eyes I hadn't seen yet. Not anger, exactly. More like she was recalculating something. "So that's it? We just live here on your terms, forever? You live here because my son asked to stay and look after me. And I said yes, because I love him," I said. "That offer was never about terms, Marvella. It still isn't, unless somebody wants to make it one." Garnett looked between the two of us like a man standing in the middle of a road watching two cars he couldn't stop. "Mama, all we're saying is—" "I heard what you're saying," I told him gently, because none of this was really his fight to begin with. "And my answer is no. Not because I don't trust you both. Because nothing about how this house works needs changing right now." I finished my dinner in a kitchen that had gone quieter than it should have for a Tuesday. Garnett excused himself not long after, said he had calls to make for work, and left me and Marvella alone with the dishes. I was almost to the hallway, dish towel still in my hand, when I heard her mutter it to herself at the sink, low, not meant for me, but not careful enough either. "I'm not going to live like a guest in my own marriage." I stopped in the hallway, just out of sight, and stood there a moment longer than I needed to, because something about the way she said it didn't sound like a complaint. It sounded like a decision. The changes started small enough that I almost talked myself out of noticing them. First, it was the kitchen cabinet, the one closest to the stove where I'd kept my good pots for 20 years. I went looking for my cast iron skillet one morning and found pasta boxes and cereal in its place instead. "I moved some things around," Marvella said when I asked, not even looking up from her phone. "It just made more sense having the everyday stuff up front. Your pots are in the cabinet by the back door now." The back door cabinet was 3 steps further from the stove. Small thing. I let it go. Then it was my shows. I came downstairs one afternoon to find the television already on, tuned to something with too many young people shouting over each other, and Marvella curled up on the couch like she'd been there for hours. "Oh, were you wanting to watch something?" she asked, already reaching for the remote slow, like she was doing me a favor by even offering. "I just figured since you were upstairs." I told her it was fine. It wasn't, but I told her anyway, because I still believed back then that peace was worth more than principle, as long as the principle wasn't bleeding yet. It was the little comments that started to add weight, more than the moved cabinets ever did. I just think the house flows better this way. I'm trying to make things more efficient for everybody. Every sentence dressed up like a kindness, and every kindness somehow landing on something that used to be mine. I started watching her closer after that, not saying much, just noticing. The way she'd rearrange something of mine and wait, almost hopeful, to see if I'd say anything. The way her shoulders would relax just slightly when I didn't. I want you to understand something about me, since I've come this far telling you my business. I have never in my life been a woman who makes noise over small things. I raised one child, buried one husband, survived things in this life that would have broken a less stubborn woman clean in half. A moved cabinet was not going to be the thing that broke me, but I started keeping a quiet count in my head all the same, the way you count steps in the dark when you don't trust the floor anymore. That Thursday, I came home from my hair appointment and walked into the living room to sit down the way I do every single day around that time, coffee in hand, ready to put my feet up before starting dinner. My chair wasn't there. I stood in the doorway a long moment, looking at the empty space where Arthur's chair, my chair, the one he picked out himself because he said the cushion suited my back, had sat for 15 years. In its place was a sleek little accent table with nothing on it but a candle. I found it in the garage 20 minutes later, pushed into the corner behind some boxes, a thin layer of dust already settling onto the arm. Marvella came around the corner just as I was running my hand over the back of it, and she smiled, easy as anything. I was going to mention that. We needed more room for the new furniture set, and that one didn't really match anymore. I figured you wouldn't mind. I noticed the quiet before I understood what was causing it. My porch used to have company on it at least twice a week. Delphine stopping by with her famous peach cobbler. The ladies from my Bible study circling up around my kitchen table on Wednesday afternoons, laughing too loud, the way old friends do when they've earned the right to. That porch had been full of voices for years. It had been almost a month since anybody but Garnett and Marvella had sat in my living room. I told myself everybody was just busy. Delphine's grandbabies kept her running these days. The Bible study had moved locations a time or two before. I had reasons ready before I even let myself ask the real question, because some part of me already suspected I wasn't going to like the answer. Then Sister Odell called me out of nowhere on a Tuesday, voice careful in a way I wasn't used to from her. "Doretha, I hope I didn't overstep last month, stopping by like that without much notice. Marvella mentioned you'd been needing your rest more these days, so I figured I'd hold off till you reached out yourself." I sat very still, holding that phone. I never said any such thing to her. "Oh." A pause, longer than it needed to be. "Well, she seemed real sure about it, baby. I didn't want to intrude." I thanked her, told her my door was always open, and hung up with my hand shaking just slightly around the phone. That same week, I asked Marvella, careful, not accusing yet, just testing the water. "Have you been telling folks I need my rest?" She didn't even pause. "I just figured you could use some quiet, with everything going on around here. You always seem tired after people leave." "I'm not tired, Marvella. I'm 71, not feeble." "I didn't say feeble," she said, smooth as anything, already turning back toward whatever she'd been doing before I walked in. "I was just trying to help. Help." That word had started showing up everywhere lately, dressed up over things that didn't actually help me one bit. I sat with it for 2 more days before I finally picked up the phone and called Delphine myself, the one friend I trusted to tell me straight instead of soft. Delphine, why haven't you been by? It's been near a month. She got quiet on her end, the kind of quiet that already told me something before she said a single word. Doretha, I didn't want to cause trouble. Marvella called me about 3 weeks back, said it wasn't really a good time for visits anymore, that you all were going through some changes in the house and needed your space. I figured you'd call when you were ready. My chest went tight and cold all at once. She told you that? I never said that to her, Delphine, not one word of it. I believed her, Delphine said, soft, almost ashamed of it now. Why wouldn't I? She's family, baby. I had no reason to think she'd lie about something like that. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, looking around at a house that suddenly felt a whole lot bigger and a whole lot emptier than it had an hour ago. And I understood for the first time that this wasn't about cabinets or chairs anymore. This was about cutting me off from anybody who might notice. I didn't hear the whole conversation. I only caught the tail end of it, standing in the hallway with a basket of folded towels in my arms, the kind of overheard thing that lands different once you already know to be listening for trouble. You should at least know where things stand, Marvella was saying, low, to Garnett in the kitchen. It's your name too, baby. Your father built that company up from nothing, and you don't even know what's actually written down for this house. Don't that bother you? I stood still in that hallway longer than I should have, towels going cold against my arms. Garnett didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had that careful sound he gets when he's talking himself into something he's not fully sure of yet. I'll look into it. Can't hurt to know. 2 days later, he came home from work early, which wasn't like him, and went straight into the office. Arthur used to keep his ledgers in, a folder under his arm I hadn't seen him carry out that morning. I didn't ask him about it then. I've learned over the years that a closed door in your own house tells you plenty if you're willing to wait it out instead of knocking on it. It was Marvella who told me, weeks later and without meaning to, exactly where he'd gone that day. She mentioned it offhand, proud almost, the way you'd mention a man finally standing up straight after years of stooping. Garnett went down to the county records office, she said, pulled up the deed himself, said it's about time he understood his own house instead of just living in it. A deed. Public record, sitting in a filing cabinet downtown for anybody with a name and a little patience to go pull. As far as Garnett was concerned, it told him exactly what he needed to know. His name appeared in the property's chain of title through paperwork filed after Arthur's death. To Garnett, seeing his own name connected to the house felt like proof. The fact that he wasn't a lawyer made no difference. Most people see their name on an official document and assume they've reached the end of the story. Useful, as far as it went. But Arthur had never been the sort of man who left important things resting in a single piece of paper. The older I got, the more I realized he planned ahead the way some people breathe. There were conversations, documents, arrangements, pieces of the picture Garnett had never been part of because, until recently, there'd never been any reason for him to be. I knew enough, standing there listening to Marvella talk, to understand one thing. Whatever Garnett found that day, he hadn't found all of it. I didn't say a word to correct him. I'll be honest with you about that, because I think honesty matters more than making myself look better than I was in that moment. Some part of me, the tired part, the part still smarting over a moved chair and a month of empty Wednesdays, wanted to see exactly how far he'd let himself believe something before he stopped and asked another question. That night, I passed by the kitchen and saw him sitting alone at the table, the paperwork spread out under the overhead light, his finger tracing along the lines like he was reading scripture. His whole posture had changed, shoulders back, chin up just slightly. A man who thought he'd finally found solid ground to stand on. He didn't see me in the doorway. I watched him a moment longer, watched him fold those papers back along their creases with a kind of quiet satisfaction, like a man closing a deal nobody else even knew he was making. Then he slipped them back into the folder and sat there smiling to himself. Not a big smile, just a certain one, the kind that comes from believing you've finally figured something out. I remember looking at him and thinking the same thing I used to think when he was a boy trying to put bicycles together without reading the instructions. Confidence and understanding aren't always the same thing. Sometimes they only look alike from a distance. Looking back now, I know more about that week than I did while it was happening. Because some of it Garnett told me himself much later, in a kitchen that felt different by then. But I'll tell it to you the way I understand it, because the order of things matters. He almost called a lawyer. He told me later he sat with his phone in his hand one evening, a number already pulled up from somebody at work, who'd mentioned a man who handled property questions. His thumb hovered over the call button, the same way mine hovered over a certain name that night in the car. He said something in him wanted to ask one simple question: whether the paperwork meant what he thought it meant. But that wasn't the only number he thought about calling. There was another one. Ruben's. Not because Ruben was a lawyer, he wasn't, but because Ruben had been Arthur's closest friend for years. And if anybody alive knew how my husband handled important matters, it would have been him. Garnett admitted later that the thought crossed his mind more than once. Then he talked himself out of that call too. Partly because he didn't want to look foolish. Partly because he was afraid Ruben might tell him something he didn't want to hear. Marvella walked in and found him staring at the screen. "What are you doing?" "Thinking about calling somebody." She glanced at the phone. "For what?" "Just to make sure I understand everything." Marvella laughed. Not cruel. Not exactly. Just confident. "Garnett, you went down there yourself. You pulled the records yourself. You read them yourself. What exactly is a lawyer going to tell you that you don't already know?" "I just want to be sure." "Sure of what?" she asked. "That your father's house belongs to you? That seems pretty straightforward." He looked back at the phone. She sat down across from him. "Let me ask you something," she said. "If that paperwork had said anything different, don't you think somebody would have told you by now?" It was a reasonable question. At least it sounded reasonable. The best mistakes usually do. "I guess." "You guess?" She smiled. "Baby, you've spent your whole life acting like everybody else knows more than you do. Maybe for once, just believe what you're looking at." He told me later that was the moment he started talking himself out of the call. Not because she forced him to, because she handed him permission to believe what he already wanted to believe. That mattered more. People don't get fooled by lies nearly as often as they get fooled by answers they hope are true. He sat there another minute with the phone in his hand. Then he locked the screen. The number disappeared. So did the thought of calling Ruben. That should have been the end of it. But he admitted something else later too. The part that embarrassed him. The part that cost him the most to say out loud. Somewhere underneath all that certainty, he wasn't certain at all. Some part of him knew there might be another answer waiting on the other end of that phone. An answer he didn't want. An answer that might take away the future he'd already started imagining. It's easier to avoid a question when you're afraid of the answer. So he put the phone away. Not because he'd proven himself right, because he'd decided not to keep asking. That night, I passed through the kitchen and saw him sitting alone at the table. The folder lay open in front of him. His shoulders sat higher than they had in weeks. His face looked calmer, more confident, like a man who believed he'd finally solved a problem. He didn't see me standing there. I watched him close the folder and slide it aside. Then he leaned back in his chair with the quiet satisfaction of somebody who thought the matter was settled. Looking back now, that's the part I remember most. Not the paperwork, not the records, the certainty because sometimes certainty is the most dangerous thing a person can hold when they haven't actually checked whether they're right. Marvella decided to host a dinner that Saturday. A handful of her friends from her old job, women I'd met maybe twice in passing. I offered to make my peach cobbler, the one I'd been making since before any of them were born. And she said that would be nice. In that tone she uses, that sounds polite on the surface and empty underneath it. I served the cobbler myself, set the bowls down at each place with my own 2 hands, the way I've always done when somebody's a guest in my home, no matter whose name is on the lease in their own head. One of the women, a young thing with long nails and a louder laugh than the room needed, asked Marvella how she managed living with her mother-in-law. Marvella smiled, stirring her coffee slow, and said it loud enough for the whole table to catch. "Oh, it has its moments. You know how it is with the elderly. Sometimes I feel like I'm running a household and a daycare at the same time." A little laugh went around the table, easy, careless, the kind of laugh that doesn't know it's standing on somebody's chest. I kept my hands steady, setting down the last bowl. I didn't drop it. I didn't let my face do anything it shouldn't. "I just mean," Marvella went on, warming to the laugh she'd gotten. "Half the time she doesn't even remember what day it is. Bless her heart, though. We try to keep her comfortable. I have never once forgotten what day it is in my life. I knew exactly what day it was sitting at that table. A Saturday, the 18th, the same date author and I got married 44 years ago, a fact I hadn't mentioned to a soul in that room, because grief is not a thing you hand out over dinner rolls. I smiled instead. I said something light about needing more coffee and excused myself to the kitchen, where I stood at the counter a moment longer than the coffee required, both hands flat against the cold countertop, breathing slow until my chest stopped feeling so tight. When I came back, the conversation had moved on, the way conversations do. Careless people forgetting in minutes what they said that cost somebody else all evening. I watched Garnett the whole rest of that dinner. He'd gone quiet after Marvella's comment, jaw set, just slightly different than usual, eyes flicking toward me once before dropping back to his plate. I knew that look. I'd seen it on him as a boy, the look he got right before he was about to stand up for something, right before the words were halfway up his throat. He opened his mouth once, just barely, like he was about to say something to smooth it over, to correct the record in front of all those women so I wouldn't have to carry it alone. Marvella's hand found his under the table. I saw it move, quick, casual to anybody who wasn't watching close the way I was. Whatever she said to him with just that touch, it worked. He closed his mouth, picked his fork back up, and let the moment pass like it had never happened at all. I finished my cobbler in silence and understood something clear and cold for the first time that night. I could not count on my son to defend me in a room. Not even one I'd built with my own hands, one bowl at a time. The Monday after that dinner, I went up into the closet where I keep author's old things, the boxes Garnett never asks about, because he thinks grief is a country he hasn't been invited to yet. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just needed my hands busy and my mind somewhere quiet. I found his reading glasses first, folded neat the way he always left them. Then a stack of old photographs, the edges soft from handling, one of Garnett at maybe 7 years old, missing his front teeth, grinning up at his father like the man hung the moon. I sat on the edge of the bed a long while with that photograph in my lap. I used to believe, somewhere underneath everything, that the boy in that picture was still in there, that if it ever came down to it, if somebody truly disrespected me in front of him, he'd find his spine and use it. At the dinner table that Saturday, I finally stopped believing that, not because he agreed with Marvella, because he didn't disagree with her. There's a difference, a painful one. I sat there a while longer looking at that photograph, remembering scraped knees, little, league games, school concerts, all the ordinary pieces that make up a son. Then I thought about him sitting silent while strangers laughed at me in my own dining room. The distance between those two versions of Garnett felt larger than the years separating them. It wasn't anger that settled into me. I've never had much use for anger. Anger burns hot and quick. What settled into me was something steadier, something closer to acceptance. I had spent months waiting for my son to notice what was happening, waiting for him to draw a line, waiting for him to decide enough was enough. That Monday afternoon, I finally stopped waiting. I put the photograph back in its box and closed the closet door. When I came downstairs, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed, because I had. I don't believe in revenge. I want you to understand that clearly before I tell you what came next. I believe in truth. I believe truth eventually finds daylight whether people help it or not. I also found myself thinking about something Ruben had said on the phone a few nights earlier. Get some sleep. At the time, it sounded like concern. Looking back, I think it was also a man making up his mind about something. Not telling me what. Not asking permission. Just deciding. I didn't know what that decision was. I only knew Ruben well enough to recognize the difference between a man listening and a man quietly moving pieces into place. I sat down in my chair, the one Marvella had finally allowed back into the living room after weeks in the garage. The replacement chair she'd bought sat untouched in the corner. I picked up the remote, the same remote she'd taken from me, the same television she'd decided she controlled. And I scrolled through the settings until I found what I was looking for. A reminder. Sunday, 7 o'clock. The same hour my show had come on for years. I wasn't setting it because I expected a fight. I wasn't setting it because I expected anybody to change. I was setting it because some things matter simply because they're yours. That hour belonged to me. Had always belonged to me. And for the first time in weeks, I found myself smiling a little. Not because I'd won anything, not because anybody else had lost, because I had finally stopped expecting somebody else to save a place for me in my own life. I had no way of knowing, setting that little reminder with my thumb that quiet Monday evening, that I was marking the exact hour everything in that house was finally going to come apart. I stayed 2 nights at Delphine's house after that phone call, sleeping on her good guest bed with the lavender sheets, the most rested I'd felt in weeks, despite everything sitting heavy on my chest. I didn't call the house. I didn't text Garnett to say where I was. Some part of me wanted to see how long it would take before somebody under that roof noticed I was gone, and what they'd do with that silence once they felt it. What I'm about to tell you, I learned later, pieced together from Garnett and from conversations after everything finally came out into the open. But I tell it the way I understand it now, because by this point in my life, I trust what people show you in a crisis more than what they say to your face on an ordinary Tuesday. Garnett noticed first, around mid-morning, when my bedroom door stayed shut longer than usual and my car wasn't in the driveway. He told me later that a small, cold feeling moved through him standing in that hallway, though he didn't say a word about it to Marvella. He just stood there a moment too long before going on with his day, the way you do when you're not ready to name a worry out loud yet. Marvella noticed it differently. She'd gotten used to me being predictable, easy to account for, easy to plan around. A grown woman not coming home for a full night wasn't something she had a tidy explanation for, and tidy explanations were the only kind she liked keeping in her pocket. By that evening, she started making phone calls. At first, Garnett didn't think much of it. Everybody calls people. But after the 3rd unanswered call, he started paying attention. "Everything okay?" he asked from across the room. "Fine," she said too quickly. A few minutes later, she called again. No answer. Then again. Still nothing. The confidence she'd been carrying around for weeks had started slipping in small places. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for Garnett to notice. After dinner, he finally asked who she was trying to reach. Marvella looked down at the screen. For the first time all day, she seemed unsure of herself. Somebody who usually answers. That was all she said. Garnett waited for more. It never came. The evening dragged on. Every so often she'd pick up the phone, stare at it, put it back down, then reach for it again a few minutes later, like maybe the result would change if she checked often enough. At one point, Garnett asked if she wanted to leave a message. No, she said immediately. Too immediately. As though whatever needed saying wasn't something she wanted recorded anywhere. Around 10 o'clock, she made one final call. No answer. That seemed to bother her more than all the others combined. She sat there staring at the dark screen a long moment before setting it face down on the table. That's strange, she said quietly. What is? She hesitated, then shook her head. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Garnett told me later he could feel it. Not fear, exactly. Not yet. Just the first crack in something that had looked solid a few hours earlier. Because whoever she was trying to reach wasn't somebody she normally chased. It was somebody she expected to be there. Somebody she seemed to believe would always answer when she called. Before bed, he found her standing at the front window, looking out into the dark street, waiting. For what, he didn't know. Maybe she didn't know either. All he knew was that whatever confidence she'd been speaking with at breakfast that morning wasn't there anymore. And for the first time since all of this started, Marvella looked like somebody who suspected a piece of the story was moving without her. By the next morning, I was back in town, though not yet back in that house. I sat at Delphine's kitchen table, drinking coffee, waiting on a text from Ruben telling me he'd landed safe and was on his way over. What was happening back at the house that same morning, I only came to know in full once it was all laid bare later, but I tell it now the way it happened, because the shape of it matters. Garnett came downstairs to find Marvella already up, dressed sharper than an ordinary morning called for, going through what she'd say if I came back swinging accusations around. If she tries to make a thing out of this, Marvella said, pouring coffee like she was rehearsing a line, we just stay calm. Remind her this is your house now. You've got the deed. There's nothing she can throw at us that paper doesn't already answer. I don't want it to come to that, Garnett said, though he said it the way a man says something he's already decided won't matter. Maybe she just needed a night to cool off. Or maybe she's trying to make us feel guilty for finally having some say in our own life, Marvella said. Either way, we don't back down. You hear me? You've got every right to that house. I checked it myself. It's documented. It's done. Garnett nodded slow, reaching for his coffee, some of yesterday's unease already fading in the daylight, the way fear does when nothing happens to confirm it. What about your dad? He asked. You said he wasn't answering. Marvella waved a hand quickly. He's probably tied up with work. He always disappears into something eventually. The answer came too fast. Even Garnett seemed to notice. You called him 3 times. So, she snapped, then softened her voice a second later. So nothing. I said he's busy. Garnett let it drop. Marvella didn't. For the next several minutes, she kept checking her phone without seeming aware she was doing it. Every vibration from a passing notification pulled her eyes downward. Every time the screen stayed empty, her mouth tightened a little more. Then she checked something else, a text thread. Scrolled. Read. Scrolled again. Garnett couldn't see the screen from where he sat. What are you looking for? Nothing. But the answer sounded distracted, like her attention was somewhere else entirely. I don't think Garnett noticed. I think he was too busy convincing himself everything had finally settled in their favor. Marvella, on the other hand, seemed to be doing math in her head. The unanswered calls, my disappearance, the fact that nobody seemed to know where I was. Whatever conclusion she was reaching, she didn't share it. They were still in the kitchen, going back over their plan one more time like 2 people, rehearsing for a performance they were certain they'd win when the doorbell rang. Garnett glanced toward the front hall. You expecting somebody? No. The answer came instantly. Too instantly. The bell rang again. Marvella set her mug down and walked toward the front window. Not fast, not slow, just careful. She pulled back the curtain. Then she stopped. Not flinched, not gasped. Stopped. The kind of stillness that happens when the mind sees something before it understands it. Behind her, Garnett frowned. Who is it? She didn't answer. The color had gone out of her face. Marvella? Still nothing. The silence stretched. Finally, she took one slow step back from the window. Garnett had started toward her when she spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly enough to make the room feel smaller. No. What? Her eyes never left the front door. No, no, no. For the first time since all of this started, Garnett looked genuinely unsettled, because whatever was standing on the other side of that door, Marvella looked like she'd already spent all night hoping it wouldn't be there. The doorbell rang a third time, and whatever confidence had filled that kitchen only minutes earlier disappeared completely from Marvella's face. Reuben picked me up from Delphine's that morning before he ever rang that bell. I rode the last few minutes in silence beside him, watching the house I'd lived in for 30 years come into view like it belonged to somebody else's life. He knocked once, then rang, and stood there straight-backed in a suit that looked like it cost more than anything in that living room, waiting with the kind of patience that comes from a man who's never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Garnett opened the door. His face went through three things in the space of 1 second. Confusion, recognition, and then something closer to dread once his eyes landed on me standing just behind Reuben's shoulder. Mr. Dabney, Garnett said, voice unsteady. Mama, I didn't know you were… Come in, please. We walked into that living room, the one with the empty corner where my chair should have been, and Marvella stood frozen by the couch, mug long abandoned somewhere, her eyes moving between her father and me like she was trying to calculate which problem had arrived first. Daddy, this is a surprise, she managed. Is everything all right? No, Reuben said simply. It isn't. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of that room and let the silence stretch a moment before speaking. Calm as ever. Garnett, I understand you went down to the county office not long ago and pulled the deed on this house. Garnett nodded cautiously. I did. I wanted to understand where things stood. And what did you think you learned? Garnett hesitated. That my name was on it. Reuben studied him for a moment. Your name appears in the property's history, he said. That isn't the same thing as ownership. The room seemed to shrink around those words. You pulled one document and stopped looking, Reuben continued. A deed tells part of a story. It doesn't tell all of it. Your father understood that. That's why he spent months putting proper protections in place before he died. I watched Garnett's expression change, not all at once, slowly, like a man realizing he might have built an entire argument on a foundation he never actually checked. Author established a trust, Reuben said. Everything regarding this property flows through that trust. He appointed me trustee. Final authority remains with me until the conditions he set have been satisfied. Garnett stared at him. For the first time since this whole thing started, he looked less angry than confused. Then, all this time, Reuben said evenly, your mother's right to live here was protected exactly the way your father intended. Nobody spoke. Even Marvella seemed afraid to interrupt the silence. Then Reuben turned toward her. You told people this house belonged to you. Marvella lowered her eyes. You told visitors your mother-in-law was declining. You discouraged her friends from coming by. You moved yourself into authority you were never given. Daddy, no. The single word stopped her cold. You never owned this house. You never controlled this house. The only reason we're standing here having this conversation is because Doretha chose patience, where many people would have chosen something else. Marvella looked like she wanted to argue. Instead, she said nothing, because there wasn't anything left to argue with. Reuben looked back at Garnett then, and the disappointment in his face landed harder than anger would have. There's something else we need to discuss. Garnett swallowed. What? Your position at my company. The room went still again. Reuben nodded toward the back door. Walk with me. Just us. I stayed behind in that living room with Marvella while Reuben and Garnett walked out to the backyard, the same yard where they'd married under string lights Garnett hung with his own 2 hands. I didn't say much to her. There wasn't anything left worth saying yet, not until the rest of it played out. What happened between those 2 men, I learned from Garnett himself afterward, sitting in this very kitchen, his voice flatter than I'd ever heard it. Reuben stood near the fence line, hands in his pockets, looking out at nothing in particular while he spoke. I gave you a position at my company 6 years ago because my daughter married you, and because I believed, at the time, that you were a man worth investing in. I don't make that mistake lightly. Mr. Dabney, Let me finish. Reuben's voice didn't rise. It never needed to. I watched you work your way up. I signed off on promotions. I defended you when other people thought you weren't ready yet. I did those things because I believed your character would eventually match your potential. Garnett said he felt smaller with every word. I can't keep a man on payroll who lets his wife disrespect his own mother in her own living room and stands there smiling about it. That's not a character flaw I can overlook because you married well. That's the whole character, son. I saw it plain as day, standing in that doorway. Garnett said he had nothing to say to that, because there wasn't a version of defending himself that didn't sound exactly as small as it was. You're done at my company, effective today, Reuben said. I'll have HR process it properly. Nothing messy, nothing public. You'll get what you're owed, and nothing more. Garnett told me he stood there bracing for it to end there, bracing for the door closing all the way shut on him. Instead, Reuben reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded card, holding it out steady. There's a man named Castell who runs operations over at a logistics firm 2 counties over. I called him last week, before any of this happened today, about another matter entirely. He mentioned he was looking for somebody with your background. I'm not handing you a favor, Garnett. I'm handing you a phone number. What you do with it is entirely up to whether you've actually got anything real to offer once my name isn't sitting next to yours anymore. Garnett took the card with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Why would you still help me, after everything? Because letting a man fall flat doesn't teach him a single thing, Reuben said, making him stand up on his own 2 legs for the first time in his life might. When they came back inside, Marvella read the whole outcome off her husband's face before either man said a word. I watched something settle over her then, heavier than anything that had happened yet. The understanding that her father's name, the safety net she'd leaned on without ever once thanking him for it, had just been quietly removed from underneath her marriage for good. Reuben left not long after, kissing my cheek at the door, promising to call. Garnett stood alone in the driveway a long while after his father-in-law's car pulled off, the card still in his hand, the house behind him no longer feeling like anything he had a claim to. He told me later that walking back toward that front door was the longest walk he'd taken in years. Sunday came around again, 7 o'clock arriving the same as it always had. Except this time Reuben was there too, sitting in the armchair across from mine that Arthur used to favor when company came by. Garnett came in from the kitchen first, hands in his pockets, the same posture he'd had standing in that driveway days before. He didn't sit right away. He stood in front of me a long moment and I let him take his time, because some things shouldn't be rushed just to make the room comfortable again. Mama, he said, I've gone over that Sunday 100 times in my head since it happened. I keep landing on the same thing. I smiled. You looked right at me, hurting. and I smiled like it was nothing. I don't have an excuse good enough to put next to that. I'm not going to try and build one. I'm just sorry. Truly sorry. Not because of what happened with Mr. Dabney. Not because I lost the job. I was wrong before any of that ever came down on me. I studied his face a moment, looking for the performance in it. The angle. The thing people reach for when they're more sorry about consequences than about causes. I didn't find one. Just a tired man, finally standing flat-footed in front of his own mother with nothing left to hide behind. I hear you, Garnett, I said, and I believe you. That doesn't undo it. But I believe you. Marvila came forward next, slower, her eyes red-rimmed in a way that told me she'd done some crying that wasn't for show. Mrs. Bramwell, I don't know if you'll ever trust a word I say again, and I wouldn't blame you. I told myself a story about this house, about you, that made it easier to take things that weren't mine to take. I'm ashamed of that. I'm asking you to forgive me, not because my father's standing here watching, but because it's the truth. And I should have said it a long time before it ever came to this. I let that sit in the room a moment, too. Then I asked the one question that still mattered more than the television, more than the chair, more than any of the rest of it. Why'd you tell my friends not to come by? Marvella looked down. For a second, I wasn't sure she was going to answer. Then she did. Because I knew if they kept coming around, they'd see what I was doing. Nobody said anything. Not Garnett, not Reuben, not me. Because there wasn't really anywhere left to hide once the truth was sitting in the middle of the room. After a moment, I nodded. Thank you for saying it. That wasn't forgiveness, just honesty. And honesty was all I'd wanted from the beginning. I don't need either one of you to earn back every single thing all at once, I said. I just needed to hear this said plain, with nothing dressed up around it. That's all I ever called Reuben for. Not punishment, just this. Reuben sat quiet through all of it, hands folded, the satisfaction on his face not loud, just settled, like a man watching something finally land the way it was supposed to. Nobody rushed to fill the silence after that. We sat there a while, the four of us, the kind of quiet that doesn't need fixing. Then I looked over at the clock, saw it was near time, and reached for the remote sitting on the side table beside me. The same chair, the same spot it had always lived before anybody ever thought to move it to a garage. Garnett opened his mouth like he might offer to get it for me. He caught himself and let me reach for it myself instead, which told me more about how far he'd already come than any apology could have. I picked up the remote, found my show already starting, and for the first time in a long while, nobody told me to turn it off. Nobody told me to go to my room. Nobody acted like my life belonged to them. They just sat there quietly while I watched. And somehow that felt a whole lot closer to respect than any apology ever could.